Now, today we finishing up chapter 25 and going to chapter 26, talk about World War I and the aftermath. Today, look at the American involvement in the war. Look at the Committee on Public Information, the War Industries Board, the American Expeditionary Forces, the Espionage Act, 14 points, the Armistice, Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Spanish flu epidemic, 1918 to 19, the Red Scare, and the Palmer raids. Questions, any of those? Yeah, have in here. Some said that Rome was not built in a day. It certainly is not built by one man. The complex social movements, the difficult achievements, they are rarely done by individuals. It often takes help of a lot of people along the way, a lot of cooperation of a lot of people. For example, if you're going to fight a war, it means a lot of people have to work together to make that happen. If you're going to make a social movement succeed, it means a lot of people have to work together to make that happen. In American society in the early 21st century, I think it would safely say it's very jaded. A lot of people don't have belief in organizations or institutions. Very little faith in public officials or much of anything, really. So the young generation of college students and 20-somethings generally are not considered to be joiners. But that's the difference with the World War I generation, the World War II generation. The generations of 100 years ago were not looking to organizations saying, what can you do for me, or trying to find what is that perfect fit for me. They say, what can I do for this organization? What can I do to be a part of it? It's when a lot of important civic organizations being formed beginning of the 20th century, like the Rotary Club and the Lions Club. I think of it as organizations for old men and bankers and so forth, but actually those organizations do a lot of good in communities wherever they are. Scholarships, parks, raising money for hospitals and schools, like I said, Habitat for Humanity Project and so forth. So the JCs, with Organization for Young Professionals, was formed at this time. Still very common today. It's open to anybody from the ages of 18 and 40. Actually, in some way, they've done a lot of important work around the communities around the country. They have built parks, they have built playgrounds, so clean up neighborhoods, engaged in literacy projects and so forth. Like saying, are looking into a profession, I would recommend joining an organization like that. So you meet interesting people, you do interesting things, and you do things for the community, doing something more than just for yourself. You get something out of it by participating, but you're doing something more than something just for yourself. Because in the end, if you ever want anything to change in your society, it's not going to be a Facebook post isn't going to change anything. Maybe one of 1 million people signs a petition, but what are you going to do after that? And you have to follow it up with something. And at some point, you're going to have to work with other people whether you agree with them or not on every issue or not, to make something happen. So not just life of your community, but life of yourself as an individual. Now, in 1917, the United States was a very patriotic time in this country. It wasn't a question of what's in it for me. It was a question of, okay, America has a job to do. When are we going to get started? April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany and the Central Powers. America will come into the war as one of the Allied powers. But Wilson did not jump into this war willingly. His idea was not just wasn't how's it going to look in the eyes of the general public. Wasn't an idea of war just for war's sake. He knew what this war meant. He knew he was committing American men to die. Looking at the world situation, looking how Germany was basically now threatening all major powers around the world, whether they're in the war or not, he felt America could not simply stand by anymore. Germany's willing to take the war to the United States. Germany's already willing to carve up the United States. The Germans are attacking American ships. So Congress voted for war. The war situation in 1917 stood very desperate for the Allies. British drive in Flanders had failed miserably that spring. April 1917, the French army mutinies. Actually, all those troops had lived all those months in those trenches, no relief in sight, just walked off the line. Tens of thousands of men just up and left their positions. Some went as far as demanding that their entire units be reorganized. They elected new officers. To dozens of divisions, I saw this happening. It's only because the French government had so heavily censored the French media that no one knew this had happened until after World War I. Because if the Germans had found out this was happening, they could have barreled through French positions very easily. But the French army quickly regained control of the situation, improved conditions for soldiers in the trenches, and like I said, the Germans were none the wiser. By the meantime, the Germans sank an unprecedented 881,000 tons of shipping that spring. So dozens of merchant ships lost. 1916, the Battle of Verdun was fought. The battle ended up taking several months. The bloodiest battle in human history. 1 million people died in that battle. Ended in a stalemate. All lives thrown away for nothing. 1 million. About a third of the population of Arkansas. Well, like the nations of Europe when they entered the war in 1914, America enters the war in 1917 very enthusiastically. And America began censoring movies, newspapers, magazines, and such for content. Essentially, there's a lot of censorship in the media. And in every war America's in, there's always this debate over how far should the freedom of speech go in wartime. Well, actually, I have some arguing that the Bill of Rights is just a peacetime document, but you can see the obvious dangers there, that somebody with a rather nefarious agenda can just proclaim total endless war and constantly upend American liberties. But you have some saying that some liberties have to be curtailed so the nation can defend itself. But you have others who say, if we are censoring speech, if we are curtailing and limiting certain American rights, then what are we really fighting for as Americans? Because what is America, if not then some of our rights as human beings? But super patriotism was the order of the day. It's not enough to be 100% American. You got to be 110% American. So more than just flag waving. And anything with a German-sounding name immediately became suspect. Started changing the names of German things to start to sound less German. For example, Dachshunds, the little German wiener dogs. Started calling them Liberty Pups. Sauerkraut began to be called Liberty Cabbage. Hamburgers began to be called Liberty Sandwiches. The hamburger sandwich is named after a city in Germany, Hamburg. Some German towns changed the name to sound less German. For example, Brandenburg, Texas changed its name to Old Glory, Texas. Of course, a lot of Allied powers are doing similarly. St. Petersburg, Russia, for example, changed its name to Petrograd to sound less German. Interestingly enough, the King of England, his family, the royal family, was German. So they changed the royal family their name to the House of Windsor to sound less German, to sound more English. True story. Queen Victoria, who was the Queen of England during the late 19th century, her grandson was the Kaiser of Germany. Another grandson was the King of England, and another grandson is the Tsar of Russia. Basically, all the royal families of Europe are so intermarried that these cousins are all willing to throw away millions of lives to destroy each other's countries. Do you think your family's messed up? Well, the American forces, as they go overseas, can be called the American Expeditionary Forces. They put in command of General John J. Pershing. Remember from the V expedition. It's a very popular general. That's it. But in spite of American willingness to join the fight, though, and preparations that had started as early as 1915 for a war, America really wasn't ready for a fight. The U.S. Army in 1917 consisted of 200,000 officers and men. And not a lot. They had 300,000 old rifles, 55 outdated airplanes. Just goes to show you how fast aeronautical technology is advancing. Airplanes had only been invented 14 years earlier, and the airplanes that the U.S. Army Air Corps has are already outdated. They're already obsolete. You had 1,500 machine guns, and 2 field radio sets. That's it. So everything, all the messaging by telegraph or put somebody on horseback to ride to the next station. But shortwave radio is becoming very popular. You didn't have broadcast radio stations yet. That's not until after World War One. But say what's called wireless telegraphy was already starting to emerge. So, what might have been impressive under other circumstances, though, Central Powers are pulling in everything they've got into this fight. 200,000, an army of 200,000 simply wouldn't be enough. So, in May of 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act. Essentially, the draft. It's only the second draft in American history. The first one had been instituted during the Civil War. Both the North and the South had their own versions of it. It basically required all men between 21 and 30 had to register for the draft. So all men, regardless of anything else, they could be exempted for certain disabilities, but everybody had to register. Later, this age changed to between 18 and 45. So by June, 9.5 million men registered for the draft. And ultimately, 24.2 million men were registered under the Selective Service Act. About 2.8 million of whom were eventually inducted into the Army.
So do you think women should be included in the draft? The whole equality movement going on?
Well, this way. Selective Service Act was put in place because America needed a lot of troops very quickly. So it was disbanded after World War One. The 1940, the peacetime draft was instituted because the United States had a very small army. We whittled down our army a lot after World War One, basically back down to about this level. As we realized World War II is coming, we realized we're going to have a big army real fast. Because America traditionally did not have a large peacetime army. So, why men register for the draft today, once you turn 18, that is under the terms of the 1940s Selective Service Act. All men have to register. But we haven't had a draft since 1975. So for the last 40 years, it's been an all-volunteer army. Since World War II, we've had a large peacetime army because technology's changed and America's become a world power. We realize we may not have time to build up a large army. Up until World War I, until the 1920s, 1930s, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were barriers. Like I say, if anybody wanted to attack the United States, they'd have to build up a large army and ship it all the way across the ocean to get here. Quite an undertaking. That'd take months to do, and we realized we'd have time to meet the demand. But you're talking intercontinental ballistic missiles. You're talking armies to be shipped all over the world at just a very short time. So we wouldn't have those weeks or months to build up an army. We had to have one fast. So we have a large peacetime army. It's an all-volunteer army now. But we are a very heavily technology-dependent army, so which means anybody can pretty much do practically anything in the Army. They have women in infantry positions now, in artillery positions. They have women commanding naval vessels now. They have women in the missile silos ready to launch their nuclear missiles at any moment. So the whole question really is, do we need to draft at all in 2016? But whether women, it was proved that women can do anything in the Army, anything in the military that's available, but should they be forced into the draft? That's an entirely different question. So do we need a draft? And if so, who would we draft? Because there are certain qualifications the military would set.
Yeah.
Got a question?
What's the 18 to 45 minutes?
That's what they later set the age limit for the draft for. Between 18 and 45. Back in World War I, the women really are just simply reduced to roles of clerks and nurses, or any kind of military positions at all. So now you got to pay for the war. Yeah. So how are you going to pay for all? How are you going to pay for 2.8 million men being inducted into the Army? How are you going to pay for all those ships? How are you going to pay for all those uniforms? And you got to pay for those. Those men need salaries too. They need to eat. Wars are expensive. Very expensive. You got to figure out a way. How are you going to pay for that war? Remember what's happening in Europe at this point? After World War I, all these nations are basically going to be broke. They spent every dime they had on war. Like I say, you can't just simply say, well, we'll just borrow it and pay it back later. Okay, how are you going to pay it back later? Can't go and say, oh, well, Iraqi oil is going to pay for it. You know it's not going to happen. You have to pay for your own. You have to pay for your own war. So, the U.S. finances this in part through $10 billion in taxes, partially through the new income tax. Tax rates are increased to raise this money. In fact, for upper income earners, they're raised to a very high level to prevent war profiteering. Basically, that's a horrible insult to say that someone's trying to make money off of the war. $10 billion in taxes and $23 billion what they call Liberty bonds. Basically, savings bonds for the U.S. government. See a post here on page 757. The Liberty Long Drive of 1917. Essentially, it's a savings bond. They're encouraging people to buy these savings bonds to help finance the war effort. Basically, the money you give at that point, the government takes to help finance the war. Promise within 20 years that bond will mature. They pay back basically double what you paid in. Like I said, the war ultimately cost about $32 billion. About $700 billion in today's money. And of course, they didn't have these high-tech jets and radar equipment, and didn't have half the radio technology they had today, in addition to the high-tech medical equipment. Well, the patriotic fervor is so intense that in one case, neighbors accused a man of not buying enough Liberty bonds, so they stole his car, sold it, and used the proceeds to buy Liberty bonds in the man's name. True story. The Committee on Public Information was launched to basically focus Americans' attention on the war. Basically, to remind Americans, why are we fighting this war? And we sell it to the American public. So the Committee on Public Information, they launched propaganda films. Remember, these are all silent, so you have a typical kind of overacting you see in old silent movies. Trying to portray the Germans very sinister ways. For example, page 760 is a still image from one of those propaganda films. Next, they place articles in newspapers and magazines, and they also had a group of people called what they called 4-minute men. Essentially, these are people who go around the country, speak to organizations all over the country, classrooms, churches, civic organizations, standing on street corners, whatever, and just explain in 4-minute speech why are we fighting this war and why is it important that we support it. The economy is placed under the War Industries Board. Essentially, America needed to mobilize fast and put all the resources into this war. So they're doing something they never before did. Basically, the government is going in and ordering factories to convert to wartime production. They're not going to produce consumer goods anymore. They're going to produce what the government tells them to do. For example, a certain number of textile mills, they're told, you will produce uniforms. Auto manufacturers, you'll produce cars for the Army, trucks are for transporting goods and troops, you'll produce tanks and airplanes. This head War Industries Board, head by a man named Bernard Baruch, is a Wall Street financier. And he decided which factories to convert and also set their prices, basically what are they going to charge the government for all this. Again, there's not going to be any war profiteering going on here. And of course, the last thing you need during a war when you're trying to ramp up production, trying to produce all the supplies and munitions the fighting men need, is a strike. So the National War Labor Board is created. This helped to basically settle a labor dispute between management and employees to make sure there would not be any strikes or work stoppages during the war. So because of this, the federal government is basically giving its approval to the existence of labor unions, basically guaranteeing they would receive a fair hearing during the war. So because of this, union membership increased by 1.5 million between 1917 and 1919. Even though you have the super patriotic feel during the time, a lot of fears of sabotage and spying. 1917, the government passed the Espionage Act. First of several acts meant to prevent sabotage, espionage, and spying. The Espionage Act gave the government powers to combat spying, sabotage, and particularly obstruction of the war efforts. Fairly loosely defined terms. So, essentially, under the Espionage Act, it became a crime to criticize the U.S. government. He sentenced to 10 years in prison, fined up to $200,000 to be up to like $5 million in today's money. It included such things as it was illegal to insult the uniform of the Army or the Navy. It was illegal to fly the flag of an enemy outside your home. It was illegal to obstruct the draft. It was illegal to criticize the Constitution or the form of government of the United States. It was illegal to obstruct, to spread false information about the war. Basically, it's illegal to say, I heard the Germans broke through the front lines in Belgium. They'll win the war in a week. That's a crime to say that. It's a crime to obstruct Liberty Loan drives. Basically, it was illegal to say, well, the government's not going to be able to pay back all that money. You're just wasting it buying that Liberty bond. That's a crime. Criticizing the war effort, that was a crime. Further acts such as the Sabotage Act and the Sedition Act, both in 1918, strengthened the federal government's position, making it a crime to criticize U.S. participation in the war. Of course, you have First Amendment, but the federal government's arguing the U.S. needs to defend itself, and freedom of speech needs to be curtailed during wartime. But these acts, like the Espionage Act, are aimed at radical groups like the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, which is a radical labor union, and the Socialist Party. You see, American socialists never gave up their pacifist views, unlike European socialists. Eugene Debs, the socialist leader for many years, he was arrested under the Espionage Act. Sentenced to 10 years in prison, but he actually ran for president while in jail in 1920. How about skipping the middleman? But Debs was pardoned in 1921. And since the communists are now in power in the Soviet Union, you actually had a large number of American socialists going to the Soviet Union to escape a prosecution. Well, in 1918, Woodrow Wilson steps forward with what he calls the 14 points. As American troops are starting to arrive in Europe, Wilson is outlining his proposal for a post-war peace. Essentially, his ideas of mediating the war are still largely intact. He's dedicated to Allies winning, defeating the Germans overwhelmingly without question, but he's looking to pass the war. What kind of world is the world going to build afterward? So Wilson is essentially trying to frame the debate for the negotiation of the peace treaty afterward, after the Allied victory. And this is what he's looking for here. Keep this handy. Already got one? Okay. During World War I, Woodrow Wilson called the war to end all wars, and often said the war had to be fought to make the world safe for democracy. Which became common recurring slogans during the war: make the world safe for democracy. The war to end all wars. And what he wants to do through the 14 points is eliminate all the reasons that started the war. Get rid of all those problems, settle all those disputes once and for all. He's wanting a free, fair world, one where nations are created equally and with respect. Essentially a new democratic world. Essentially a world free from colonialism, imperialism, or tyranny. Call for, among other things, open covenants to be openly arrived at. There's no more secret peace treaties. Freedom of the seas, peace and war for all nations. Removal of economic barriers to equality of trade among nations. It is free trade. Reduction of armaments to the level needed only for domestic safety. Essentially, no more arms races. That's what you need to defend yourself. He wants to dismantle overseas colonial empires. And Smith is looking at basically redrawing the maps of Europe and the Central Powers. Evacuation of Russian territory, evacuation and restoration of Belgium, restoration of all French land, return of the province of Alsace-Lorraine to France, which France had lost to the Franco-Prussian War. Readjusting a lot of the borders of Europe along lines of nationality, particularly Italy, the breakup of Austria-Hungary and the self-determination for all the different peoples of that country. Basically, break it up into about a dozen different countries. Evacuation of Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, free access to the sea for Serbia. Break up the Ottoman Empire, securing sovereignty for the Turkey, but freedom for all the other subject areas of the Ottoman Empire, which basically would be the creation of the modern Middle East. An establishment of independent Poland. Poland basically been taken over by Russia in the late 1790s. Now Poland become an independent nation once again. And Wilson saw as the crowning achievement of it the establishment of a League of Nations. Basically have all the nations of the world come together and sit and discuss their differences. Instead of going to war, go to mediation. Throwing away all his lives, sit and talk. Discuss your differences. The idea that reasonable men can sit and reason together. The League of Nations would afford mutual guarantees of independence and territorial integrity, but to maintain world peace. That the nations of the world did not have to go to war. The idea that there is nothing inevitable about war. It can be avoided. It's a choice you can avoid. Essentially, Wilson's looking for a peace without victors. Basically, saying to the world, let's start over. But his idealism, though, is met with the bitter cynicism brought on by years of war and crippling losses. You can see here, most of his ideas are either not fulfilled or severely compromised. Only a couple of them are fulfilled outright. Although this is his model for a reconstruction of a democratic world, trying to basically his progressive ideas on a global scale, 14 points so severely compromised, actually kind of symbol of his ultimate failures in the world stage. Well, in 1917, the revolution had broken out in the bankrupt, destitute Russia. The Tsarist regime collapsed and communists came to power in November 1917. And civil war broke out in Russia to keep the communists from seizing or holding power. And this war lasted for 4 years. Millions of people died in the Russian Civil War. In fact, Europe and even the United States even sent troops to Russia after World War I to try to prevent the communists from maintaining power in Moscow, but they were unsuccessful. Well, once the communists seized power in Moscow, the new government signed an armistice with Germany. Basically, Russia left the war. They made a separate peace with Germany. Broke the alliance, said, we're making peace with Germany, we're pulling out. The result, they had to sign away basically most of the Western Russian Empire. The Baltic states, Poland, the Ukraine were signed away in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. Essentially, they're saying to the Western Allies, you're on your own. Of course, the people half starved, half their army deserted at this point. No one can really blame them. But as a result, ends up happening horrifies the fear that horrified the West for years. All those troops from Russia are now free to turn around and fight on the Western Front against France. Essentially, the Schlieffen Plan worked in reverse. They ended up winning the war in Russia first. Instead of winning a quick war in France and turning around and fight Russia, they're done fighting Russia, and now they're turning around and fight France. Germany shifted as many troops as it could against the West and launched a massive offensive in spring of 1918, which stalled out. And by this time, you have increasing numbers of American troops which were able to help absorb the incoming German troops. And by late September, the Allies launched and called the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Essentially the last major Allied offensive of the war. Essentially the Germans have nothing left. They have no reserves, no more men they can draft. Essentially they've thrown everything they had in Allies and they are exhausted. They have nothing left. So the Allies now start rolling over the Germans, start rolling them back steadily. The worn out Germans are basically finished off during the fall of 1918. At this point, Germany knows it's losing the war. Although Allied troops have yet to swarm across the German border, Germany had asked President Wilson for an armistice that is a ceasefire on October 6th. But Wilson would not agree to it without the support of the other Allied powers. They had to meet Allied terms for war to end. At the end of October, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Austria-Hungary, the other Allied powers, the other Central Powers, had left the war. Austria-Hungary had basically already split up several different states declaring their own independence. Austria and Hungary had gone their separate ways. But Germany holds on. It only ends when the German Navy mutinies in early November. They rise up, naval personnel seizing key outposts across the country, the people rising up against the Kaiser. The Kaiser flees to the neutral Netherlands for his own safety. So basically you have a new government now in Russia by the end of the first week of November. And the first order of business, end the war. So the German High Command meets with the Allied High Command in France, and end up meeting in a rail car, negotiating over the final end of the war. And at 4 a.m. on November 11, Germany and the Allies agreed to a ceasefire that go into effect at 11 a.m. that morning. In effect at the 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month. So the fighting ends on November 11th, 1918. Remember, it's just a ceasefire at this point, the armistice. This agreed they're just going to stop fighting. The formal terms of the peace still have yet to be determined. Now, for years afterward, November 11th was set aside as an Armistice Day to honor the veterans of the Great War. Similarly, Memorial Day is originally set up to honor Civil War veterans, primarily Union veterans. Some southern states that have it called Confederate Memorial Day. But after World War II, Armistice Day in the United States, the scale was changed to honor all veterans. And Veterans Day has been reserved on November 11th ever since. But still, in some countries, in the Allied countries like Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, France, still sometimes it's called Armistice Day or Remembrance Day. Well, like I said, the war is now over. And a great sense of relief. But Europe now had to pick up the pieces. Fortunes that the great powers of Europe had amassed after centuries of colonization overseas was spent. Europe would never be as rich or as powerful again. Entire generation of young Europeans was wiped out. Something they would do in England was try to encourage men to sign up for the army. They try to organize units on a local basis, along the lines of a small town or village, even a neighborhood. So basically, all the guys you grew up with, you're basically encouraged by this. You go up, you join together, you go to war together, you fight together, but y'all die together. So you'd end up seeing entire towns or villages where there were no men of fighting age around. That entire generation of men was just missing. In fact, you find things like that all over Europe, that a lot of men of that age simply just wouldn't find. The last veteran of World War I died about 5 years ago. So all those veterans, all those troops are now gone. So that chapter in history is closed. But the consequences would be far-ranging. The British Empire, for example, settled the debts and fewer men to draw upon, entered into a slow decline, started slowly dismantling their colonial empire. Germany, though largely untouched by the ravages of marching armies and artillery, lost its men, its world influence, its fortune. This point still to be something of a pariah in world affairs. The economy was shattered, and will later be shattered with heavy reparations that further crippled the German economy. And war didn't seem as glamorous before this, to be reviled afterwards. You especially see it in the art and the literature of the 1920s. And the idealism with which these young men went off to war was replaced by cynicism and bitterness. Future political leaders would be far more hesitant to go to war. So, in Germany, you have a young corporal who is blinded by a gas attack, swore revenge against everyone to rob Germany of its greatness. And obviously, if he regained his eyesight, he would get involved in politics, rise to power, make Germany a great power. And unfortunately for the world, Adolf Hitler regained his eyesight. Overall, 15 million people died in World War I. That includes 112,000 Americans. Just as few short months the Americans were in the fighting, 112,000 died. Now, the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the ceasefire was in place, but the conditions of that lasting peace had yet to be settled. For example, North and South Korea signed an armistice in 1953 to end the Korean War, but a formal peace treaty was never signed, so technically the two sides are still at war. But the treaty basically be negotiated by the four major Allied powers. Here at page 766, you see the leaders of the four major powers here, called the Big Four. And the result of the treaty on 768. So the Big Four included U.S. President Woodrow Wilson.
What's these for? The Big Four?
Big Four, yeah. President. Now these are the four major leaders of the four major Allied countries. They're basically leading the negotiations of the peace treaty. You have British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. You have French President Georges Clemenceau. And you have Italian Premier Vittorio Orlando. Wilson comes with 14 points as his framework piece, but Wilson travels overseas to Paris for the negotiations. In fact, he's the first American president to travel overseas during his presidency. He greeted about 2 million ecstatic Parisians on his arrival and wants a just peace without vendettas. For the Allied leadership, many of the people, though, they wanted revenge for the Kaiser's actions. In fact, Lloyd George had campaigned for election in England in 1918, promising to hang the Kaiser once the war was won. The Kaiser actually ended up spending the rest of his life in the Netherlands and was never prosecuted for any war crimes or anything like that. Clemenceau wanted to end the German menace to France once and for all. Orlando is looking to expand Italian territory, just basically wanted something for Italy's efforts. But Wilson was forced to abandon or negotiate his key portions of his ideas of national self-determination, these 1,014 points. So you can see here on page 768, Germany and Austria-Hungary just membered the treaty, creating independent states of Poland and Czechoslovakia, which had large German minorities in it. The disparate Slavic nations in southern Europe were hobbled together into Yugoslavia. Poland was given free access to the sea at the port of Danzig, but that arrangement ended up splitting Germany in two. German colonies in Africa and Asia were taken away from Germany, divided up among the Allies. Instead of being given their independence, basically given mostly to England or France. The Ottoman Empire split up with the nations of Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine given to England and France basically as colonies. Independent, but they're called mandates or League of Nations mandatory states. Essentially, England and France would administer these countries, but everybody knew basically they were running them. No mention of free trade, freedom of the seas, or disarmament being made. Some treaties in the 1920s attempted to limit naval tonnage, but these treaties failed as Japan built up its navy in the 1920s and 1930s. The treaty did include the League of Nations, which dedicated itself to protecting the independence and territorial integrity of other nations, but the debate over the League of Nations in the United States basically would rob it of its usefulness. The treaty was finalized February 1919, and Wilson returned home. Wilson returns to a rousing welcome. Most Americans favored the League of Nations, and 33 governors had endorsed it, but many Republican senators had opposed it. Particularly this man, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Massachusetts Republican. The Republicans regained control of the Senate in 1918. Basically, so many men off fighting the war, and such a low voter turnout that the Democrats lost control of the Senate. And so, Massachusetts Republican, a Republican has not been elected to the U.S. Senate for Massachusetts in almost 40 years. But New England, although very liberal today, was very heavily Republican in those days because there was a very strong liberal wing of the Republican Party back then. They're called Yankee Republicans in New England. Actually, Bull Moose Progressives. Here's the way the League of Nations would work. You'd have a General Assembly made up of all nations. You'd have the smaller council of made up of the major powers of the world. Or the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and 4 other nations elected by the General Assembly on a rotating basis. So it's similar to the modern structure of the modern United Nations in many ways. So the League of Nations would also establish a court of international justice meant to arbitration any dispute that threatened the peace. But when the United States fails to enter the League of Nations, that robbed the League of Nations of a lot of its potential influence. Because consider what the United States had to offer. 1918, we are the largest economy in the world. We're the largest producer of manufactured goods in the world. We're the holder of the debt for most of that, for basically the Allied nations. But also look at the United States from a moral standpoint. We once had been a colonized nation ourselves, so the former colonies of the world respected us for that position. And as a military and economic power, the colonial power respected us for the power we expressed in that way. So essentially, we're seen as a fair broker between the two, between the colonies and the colonizers. So our moral influence as a democratic nation, the idea of fairness and law. But when the United States did not enter the League, all that's gone. Essentially, you have these large colonial powers, very ambitious colonial powers. There's no one basically to keep them focused and guide them. So essentially, the League of Nations just drifts along. As World War II approaches, the League of Nations is a little more than a glorified debating society. They can't do anything to stop the buildup of Japan or Germany. Because the United States was not in there to stand up for the principles of the League. So, could the League have stopped World War II? Could the League have kept the Allies focused on keeping Germany from breaking the Treaty of Versailles? There's a very good chance it could have. But the U.S. didn't enter the League. That's because of this man right here, Henry Cabot Lodge. And he did it for the most petty reason of all. He hated Woodrow Wilson. It wasn't ideology for him, it was personal. Lodge once said, "I cannot imagine hating a man any more than I hate Woodrow Wilson." Now, Wilson was kind of the stern professor type, but not warm and cuddly, but Lodge just had an intense dislike for the man. Which is the problem in politics, which is when you get elected to an office, you have to work with people you don't necessarily agree with. But he's in charge of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which means the Treaty of Versailles and the treaty regarding League of Nations has to come through his committee before it goes to the full Senate. And immediately upon Wilson's arrival, Lodge voiced objections to the League and presented a round robin, basically a parliamentary petition, signatures of 37 senators pledging to vote against the League if no amendments were added to it. This gave Lodge enough votes to defeat it. In fact, when he reports the Treaty of Versailles out of his committee, he has 14 objections attached to it, one for each of Wilson's 14 points. Wilson went back to Paris, attacking his critics, and negotiated a few amendments to the treaty, getting the Allies to agree the League of Nations would not interfere in domestic affairs, and members could opt out of the League. So the Treaty of Versailles is signed on June 28, 1919. But the United States will never ratify the treaty, in large because of Henry Cabot Lodge.
June 14th?
What's that?
You said June 14th?
June 28.
Oh,
Treaty of Versailles is negotiated in the old French royal palace. You had 14 Republicans, including William Bohr of Idaho, called irreconcilables. Basically, they're opposed to the treaty and the League of Nations at all costs. But you had some kind of on the fence, like Senator Frank Kellogg of Minnesota. 12 others were called mild reservationists. Basically, there are circumstances in which they could support it, but they need a little bit more than what Wilson's willing to give at this point. The concerns about constitutionality and national sovereignty are the utmost of the concerns. Of course, the Constitution gave the Senate the power to make treaties, and there have been organizations like this the United States entered into before, like the Pan American Congress. This is a little larger and a little bit stronger. But Wilson brushed these aside in favor of the issues of international cooperation and preserving peace. Wilson went on a nationwide speaking tour to garner support for the League, promising to support the League of Nations because let's not have our men die in vain. Let's make sure that through the League, American men will never have to go overseas and die in foreign wars again. But Lodge managed to delay the vote on the treaty. And so long enough for Wilson to go across the country campaigning for it, but the strain of the war, the treaty negotiations, and the debate of the League of Nations caused Wilson to have a massive stroke on October 2nd, 1919. In 1919, there wasn't a lot they could do for a stroke. Basically, to set your affairs in order and hope you survive. Today, there's a lot more they could do with a stroke. If they found the symptoms, they might be able to clear it up very quickly if you get to a hospital in time. Physical therapy, they could do something for any of the effects of paralysis that stroke sometimes bring about, but there's nothing they could do in 1919. Wilson is in pitiful shape after the stroke. Basically, he's completely paralyzed on his right side. The rest of his life, he was confined to a wheelchair and had trouble speaking. But his wife, Edith Wilson, strictly limited his visitors and work schedule, and even guided his hand to sign important documents. In fact, she was so influential over his decision-making that some people said she basically was acting as president. Now today, something like that would happen. The vice president would be acting president until the president could considered to be healthy enough to resume his duties, but no such provision at this point. Vice President Marshall was afraid to take the position of acting president because of the precedent that it might set. It was afraid that what might happen in some future vice president. It's afraid some vice president might try to take over the country. But remember, there's no system in place in 1919. Well, on November 19th, 1919, following Wilson's orders, the Democrats voted against the treaty that had Lodge's reservations attached to it, voted 39 to 55. Basically, Lodge had shredded the treaty in the League of Nations, basically making it practically useless. Motion to approve the treaty without reservations failed by just the opposite vote, 38 to 55. Pleas for compromise went out that neither Wilson or Lodge were willing to budge. Wilson, though, is really in no condition to negotiate. Lodge really doesn't have an excuse, and a few people in the Senate who could make a compromise with each other just simply couldn't do it. Well, the treaty, with some of the reservations added in, came up for a second vote in March 1920, but failed by a vote of 49 to 35, 7 votes short of the 2/3 majority needed to ratify it. So the United States stays out of the League of Nations. But at that point, look at chapter 26. Next time, look at the world after World War I. So no questions. We'll see you all Monday.